Hello and welcome to One Slot. The mission is to further conversations that seek solutions to the many challenges that confront the continent. We believe that solutions are found by asking the right questions. And today, we are seeking a better understanding of the nexus between corruption and the recent coups in Africa. In the last 18 months, there have been 7 coups and coup attempts. The military succeeded in seizing power in Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan, but they failed in Niger and most recently in Guinea-Bissau. Now, coup plotters in Guinea fingered poverty and endemic corruption as reasons for overthrowing 83-year-old President Alpha Condé. The soldiers in neighboring Mali last year claimed theft and bad governance. The Sudanese and Zimbabwean generals who toppled Umar al-Bashir in 2019 and Robert Mugabe in 2017, respectively, deployed similar arguments. These are not new sentiments, to be honest. In the early post-colonial decades, when coups were rampant, Africa's coup leaders virtually always offered similar reasons: corruption, mismanagement, poverty. Why are African leaders failing? What is this nexus between corruption and coups in Africa? Will an understanding perhaps point a way out? My guest today is Francis Kaifala, Commissioner of the Anti-Corruption Commission of Sierra Leone. He is also President of the Network of Anti-Corruption Institutions in West Africa. As head of the Anti-Corruption Commission of Sierra Leone, his result-oriented leadership has favorably led the institution's success in the fight against corruption, with record improvement in all global and local indexes, surveys, and reports. It is my pleasure to welcome you to One Slot. Mr. Francis Kaifala, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Felicity. I'm very pleased to be here.
One too many, some would say. We've had several coups between 2020 and now, more than witnessed in any decade, in the past 2 decades to be precise. The trend seems to be picking up this year already. Why are coups making a comeback in Africa?
I think the thing is, we are back to most parts of Africa, particularly West Africa, are going through difficult economic times, economic challenges, where the people believe that their lives should have been better by now after trying democracy for probably, at least we have had 2 decades of stability with democracy. But in many of these countries, they have not seen the effect of that in their lives, and they are going back to blame the same things that were blamed for the coups in Africa: corruption, state capture, mismanagement of state resources, lack of responsiveness of government. It is all the same justification that we were getting in the 60s and 70s that we are getting again. And unfortunately, most of it is backed up with the people who, like I said, their lives have not really improved as they would like. So they are in support of anything that can bring them hope.
These are not new sentiments. I mean, one would expect that in the past 2 decades, Africa has developed, have grown. So why is it that we are looking for solutions in things that are actions like coups that has not bordered well for us in the past?
That's the point. You have to also look at the point that the people who experience coup d'etats, the generation that experienced coup d'etats in the 60s and 70s are phasing out. The young generation, most of whom were born in the 90s, coming up in the year 2000 to date, have not really experienced the effect of such things. They do not understand that they do not really change the lives of their people. In fact, every time a country has coup d'etat, it has the tendency of taking that country backwards more. So the little progress that they have made is being taken for granted. They do not, and the coup leaders are capitalizing on this to seize power in their respective countries. And of course, they have control over the narrative when they are in power, and the people are left. But soon, in most of these countries where these coups are happening, you're going to see that 1-2 years down the line, you see that they will start realizing. In Burkina Faso, for example, you see what happened. Some people never really realized what's happening until it started hitting them. And the military is now in control. So these are things we have to grapple with in the sub-region. And I hope things can change.
I mean, you acknowledge that it is some of the realities on the ground that is, some people are justifying why we have coups today, and it's being celebrated. But the irony is that these same people who are coming into power promising to restore the rule of law by actually destroying the rule of law in order for them to be relevant and not sticking to their promise. I mean, with their instances, plenty of it, where these coup leaders turn out to be even more corrupt than the regimes that they take out of office. So if you look at it from that perspective and what history has told us, even the young have access to what has happened in the past. What would be a reaction to comments that Africans who celebrate such coup, in quote, are being self-defeatist?
Yes, I mean, like I told you, you have to also understand that we humans, generally, our memories are usually very limited when it comes to pain. And we remember the last pleasure we had and the hope of more pleasure. So those who really understand these things, like those who lived through the effects of coup d'etats in the 60s and 70s when they were prevailing, are more cautious. You see that, for example, the military who are taking power, these are younger people, most of whom were born in the 80s. And the people who are jubilating are people born in the 90s and the 2000s. And of course, those who are supposed to benefit from any such change, politicians who probably would not have had success in democratic environment, are also coming in. So my view of this is, we have not had a country in Africa where coup d'etat has really changed much for. There is no historical data which justifies it. And we can only look to see what is happening. I hope that those who have the power and responsibility to take action to ensure that democracy prevails and the rule of law prevails. Schools are there. Sometimes we know that those who have democratic power do things that go against the interests of their people, particularly corrupt regimes, but there are systems and processes to get them out. So that is my reaction. My reaction is that coups have not really done much for anybody in Africa, and I don't see it doing much now.
Okay, I mean, you've made your position clear there, but I still will put this question to you because I've asked previous guests when we talked about corruption and Africa and coups specifically. I'd asked, the celebration seems to be a welcoming of these coup d'etat. So would it be out of place to ask if there is any phenomenon that is good coup? Has there been any good coup?
Well, I think there are times when regimes really do things that make them lose legitimacy in practice. I mean, where a regime is so manifestly corrupt and widespread, irresponsive to the feelings of its people, I think there are times when these coups could, in the eyes of those who engage in them, not in my eyes or other people's eyes, but in the eyes of those who engage in them, and sometimes those who celebrate them, to be justified. But I think that there is no good coup. It is always an attack on democracy. If a leader is bad, the leader should be taken out through the ballot box. That is why elections are held periodically. And if elections are not held periodically, there are systems, there are the judicial system, there are the courts where you can also engage. So these are all things that are available, options that do not lead to using. I am against the use of force, the use of coercion to institute a regime or to bring about political change.
Okay, I'd like to take you up on the question, the submission you made about youths and not knowing history. But first, let me ask, because the concentration of this conversation is corruption and coup. On a scale of 1 to 10, how causative is corruption in this, like a major factor in coups in Africa? On a scale of 1 to 10, would you say that corruption is like 8%?
I mean, we all know that every coup that has taken place in Africa, the first justification is corruption. There is not a single coup that has taken place in Africa since the 1950s, when African countries started getting independence to date, that the justification of the coup leaders has not been predicated on corruption. So it's the number one culprit. And sometimes we all accept that indeed some of these regimes that have been removed were manifestly corrupt. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I would tell you, at least when it comes to justification, I would say that 7.
7%. Okay. So I don't forget, we'll come back to the line of conversation we're going on, but I'd like to pick your brain quickly on young people that are seemingly forgetful of what history has taught us about the dangers of coup, are celebrating and jubilating. Would you say it's a failure of our education system, or is a failure of the custodians of history from impacting on the young the importance? Because some of these coup leaders, I wouldn't say they don't know about coup and the dangers that it pertains. So why do they always choose that route, and why are the young people seemingly embracing this coup?
We have to understand this from the point of view of we humans. Like I started by saying, I studied behavioral economics, and one of the things we know that humans tend to lay more emphasis on present pleasure than past pain. So these are all factors at play. Yes, the educational factor has a role to play. History has to be able to delve more into these things, particularly the effect they had on Africa. I am not sure how this is being done in every country on the continent, but I certainly know that it is part of the syllabus. I studied it when I was in school. Coups in Africa was part of it, from Ghana to Gambia to Sierra Leone to Guinea. Every country that had coup d'etat, I studied when I was in school. So I will assume that it is done. But we have to look at it from the behavioral aspect, the emphasis on present pleasure, the emphasis on hope. When these military leaders come, they come promising hope, promising change. These are all charged wars that people who have not really lived the experience really will not understand it deeply, and they are ready to lay their hopes and bets on that hope. And that is what is happening in Africa. Again, I don't think somebody who lived, for example, in Ghana in the 60s and early 70s, or who lived in Nigeria when they saw leaders being killed and the military coming in, even up to the days of Sani Abacha, or who was in Sierra Leone when the military took over power in the early 1990s, will be very, that person will be very cautious when it comes to military takeover and things like that. I think we have to emphasize democratic processes more, and we have to learn to settle our differences without calling on the military to come from the barracks to occupy spaces that democratic processes should occupy.
All right, we'll go on a short break now, but when we come back, I'd like us to, because when we say corruption, it's a very broad term covering all aspects. We'll try and see if we can break it down and get a better perspective on that connection that is so worrisome. You're watching One Slaughter News Central. We'll be right back after this break. Don't go away. Good to know you're still with us. We still have Mr. Francis Kaifala with us, and we're looking at the nexus between corruption and coup in most recent coups in Africa. Now, most of the countries where military takeovers have happened in the past year have scored low in the 2021 Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. Why would you say corruption is endemic? Let's start from there. Would you agree that it is endemic? And Let's start from there first before I ask another.
I think corruption is very endemic. And in fact, West Africa, if we have to go by the data that is released by Transparency International, is the most corrupt part of the world. And most times corruption is endemic where there is also endemic poverty. So and these countries are countries where there is large scale of poverty and inequality. So yes, I would admit that corruption is endemic in these countries where coup d'etats have been taking place.
What kind of corruption are we talking about? Because it cuts across all facets.
There are three kinds. We have grand corruption, where public officers, usually highly placed, use their offices to enrich themselves, to embezzle public funds, to divert public funds, to provide advantage to their friends, cronies, and families and relations. And you have, of course, state capture, where you have businesses and people who have authority wield enormous power within the public space and have a large share of things like contracts. And also you have petty corruption or administrative corruption, which is more on a low scale, but that corruption is very, very corrosive. It is the bug kind of corruption. It eats the very fabric of the country little by little until it destroys everything. And all of it are prevalent in all of these countries that we are talking about.
So what is this connection between it and the coups that we have? It's used as excuse, yes, but then you understand what I'm trying to ask. It is used as excuse for coups to happen. What is this connection that makes it imperative that people continue to say corruption is the reason we're coming in?
Because the packaging of the message. It's easy for you to say that these people we are removing from power are rich and you are poor. They are using all the money to provide you health care, feed you and your children, give them good school, to enrich themselves. It's easy to point to examples. So the packaging is important for acceptability and legitimacy. So corruption is already prevalent, so it's easier to package and weaponize it as a message for the minds and attention of the people, and then for you to use it to continue your leadership.
Okay. The specialists in your field are telling us to begin to prepare for not the possibility, but the eventuality of coups in Africa. I want to ask your perspective on that. What is the level of probability that further coup in Africa is inevitable?
I think that countries have realized that this is becoming a pandemic. You know, when something happens in one place, it happens in another. You saw the swift reaction from the ECOWAS. You see the swift reaction from the African Union and other actors in the international scene like the United Nations, the European Union, and every other institution that has interest in Africa has now come in strongly to say this has to stop. The probability is always there, but I think it is very low. You can see that the attempt in Guinea-Bissau failed. I believe that most of the ones that we tried, if they do at all, will fail because countries are now ready. In Sierra Leone, for example, I saw a memo from the military where they were even warning that no soldier should be in any vehicle along the streets of Sierra Leone without a proper justification and approval provided by a senior authority. So countries are now ready. They've realized that we are going back to the 70s and 60s, and that is unacceptable. And they are taking steps to do it, both locally and internationally. The probability is now very low.
Okay, at the third part of this conversation, we'll look at some of these steps that you mentioned, if any really that we can point to. Still talking corruption though. Let's get your view on the regional blocs like AU and ECOWAS and the effectiveness of other bodies' use of sanctions when we have coups like this. We have scenarios in Guinea, for instance, where the deposed president engineered constitutional changes in 2020 to enable him serve a third term. It is a common practice now. Several leaders from Uganda's Yoweri Museveni to Ouattara in Cote d'Ivoire, they ECOWAS powers are being muted. That's what the sense we're getting, despite all the noise and energy that you mentioned, that they take out sanctions when it comes to this constitutional coups. My question would be, are there options to help, so to speak, or mute bodies like ECOWAS and others to discourage officers like the guy Damboya, that's the name, to step in, promising to save the people?
Yes, I think the international system needs to have more teeth. I am one person who believes that ECOWAS, for example, should have a standby army. We cannot be reactionary. People have to understand that when you make threats, you must be capable of backing them up. So I believe regional blocs like the ECOWAS should have their standby army to which member states can contribute, and they should be ready to intervene in such situations where processes fail. But also, I believe that the institutions have to be ready. First of all, they should have a minimum content of rules. If there is no second term, there is no second term across the board. Any president who seeks to subvert that should be treated the same way coup d'etats are treated now, because I believe that's a constitutional coup d'etat against the people by leaders who want to perpetuate themselves in power. So these are all wider conversations that the ECOWAS bloc should be having. And if we want to rid Africa of the problems we are facing, we have to be realistic in our approach, but also we should make sure that promises we make or threats we make, we back them up by action. And one of them should be that a leader who interferes with the constitution, decisive action, should be taken against that leader the same way decisive action should be taken against the military who leave the barracks and take over their country using force of arm.
I don't know whether I'm going to put this right. The bodies, these regional bodies, some of their mandate is to stand against any unconstitutional takeover of power. But we also have scenarios where corruption and all kinds of things have led to leaders changing their constitution to stay in power. That's the part I was going to. Doesn't this in some way affect the ECOWAS and AU's powers?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a coup by those leaders against their own people. It's not because you are in power does not mean you cannot commit coup against your own people. If you use the constitution to perpetuate yourself in power, you are no different from somebody who uses guns to take over power. It's just the approaches that are different. So I think that ECOWAS should have a common position on those issues. For example, if there's no two-term, there's no two-term. You go two-term, that's it. Any attempt to go over it, whether by constitutional manipulation or change, whether or not you justify it with the support of your people, the ECOWAS institution or the AU should have a common position on this. Because in that situation, you are giving justification to the military, like Doumbouya has done in Guinea, to take over power. But taking over power was not just affecting one man, Alpha Condé, who may have changed the constitution. The people may have been affected. So that is why ECOWAS has to make sure that their positions are decisive. It is forward-looking, but it is also preparing to ensure there is fairness on behalf of the people of ECOWAS, not just the leaders.
Okay, is it possible to maybe talk about some of these tweaks that you'd like to see in the way they handle cases of corruption in these countries before it escalates to the point of becoming some of their officers coming to say, we want to take care of things, we want to save the people using the mechanism of coup?
I think first of all, they should have good data system. The data that we have are usually coming from institutions like the Transparency International, which African institutions have always tried to challenge. I am not ready to argue with that, but I think that they should ensure they have good data system and believe in it. And they should have proper diplomatic means to contact these countries, to explain to them the dangers of all of this, to be able to ensure that for example, most of these things are happening because initially there will be a breakdown of rule of law. There will be a system of massive economic breakdown, and there will be serious malcontent among the people against their government. These things don't hide. It is good for these leaders to speak to themselves, but also they should have envoys. For example, we have the head of political affairs in the ECOWAS. Those are their responsibilities, to advise these countries openly and clearly and fairly across the board on some of these issues, but then be ready to do it. But the second part is also policy. Like I said, if the ECOWAS region does not want manipulation of the constitution for any president to go for 3 terms, let us have a common position. Say no one president should be for president for more than 12 years. And if the terms in your country are 2, it cannot be above 7 years, but also you cannot go for more than 2 terms. That is a policy tweak. That will be a common position. So when one leader goes against it, we know that he's not just going against it within the framework of his country, he's going against it within the framework of ECOWAS.
Okay, okay. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
And then, of course, if these things happen, it is easier to predict what ECOWAS can do or say.
True. I want to roll back a bit and speak on the economic impact. We already have a precarious situation in our hand where there is high levels of unemployment across the continent. What would be some of the, what would be the tipping point if we continue towards this part of coups and escalating corruption for the economy of the continent?
I have a feeling that every time there's a coup d'etat, there's a reversal of the progress that the country is being made. And that has, we cannot continue to be making gains and going backwards. And that is what is happening. If we make progress democratically, sometimes it's because even in these countries where they are crying economic hardship, yes, there may not be the trickle-down effect on the pockets of the people, every one of them, in terms of economic terms, but the macroeconomics might be there. There may be infrastructural development, there may be institutional improvements, there may be technical improvements in the country, which lay a foundation for long-term growth and development, which may eventually trickle down into the economics of the pockets of the people. So we cannot be reversing it by these coups. I don't know how that is going to happen, but we have to take conscientious steps to make sure that certain things are a no-no, and coup d'etats are one of them.
All right, we'll come back and look at some of these solutions. This is part of the reason we have one slot. We'll go on a short break, and when we come back, Mr. Francis Kaifala will be telling us, suggesting some ways we can reverse the trend. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. This is News Central, and we still have a guest on one slot. Mr. Francis Kaifala is speaking to us on explaining some of these nexus between corruption and coup in Africa. Mr. Kaifala, are you with us?
I am.
Okay, great. Because I couldn't see you anymore, so I was wondering if you've a network has taken you away. All right, your camera is not on. Could you put it on?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's look at it this way. Condemnations, you mentioned some of them, of coup, agreed or crucial to those who might want to grab power by force. And analysts are suggesting that the only actors who truly have the power to reverse these, pockets of coup that we see coming up across the continent are African leaders themselves. Do you agree? And how are they going to start it?
I partly agree that it's African leaders themselves, but it goes beyond that. It requires a consensus effort. The people have to be on board. If the people encourage coup d'etats, leadership is a reflection of the wishes of the people. So the people have to be on board, civil society, wider collaborative efforts. I think there has to be that intersection of consensus between leadership and people against coup d'etats for it to be eliminated from Africa, particularly West.
So if the onus lies with them, they've been around for a while. They've seen the changing trends and the things that could lead to coup happening. And one of that repeatedly is corruption. What would you say they are missing that is giving room for this corruption to continue to come in our face and bring coups?
I think it's the commitment. The commitment. You have to be the example that you preach. So, for example, we have the ECOWAS protocol on the fight against corruption. We sends out a framework for all countries to monitor the implementation of the protocol. And Ghana disseminate information, organize themselves. That is why the network of anti-corruption institutions in West Africa was set up, of which I am currently the president. We are going to have our conference in Nigeria in the next 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And the conversation is going to include these things. There has to be high-level commitment from the leaders.
When you say commitment, when you say commitment, beyond the, what kind of actions would signify that commitment you reference?
For example, by empowering the institutions that fight corruption in those countries. Almost every country in West Africa has some form of anti-corruption outfit. So we have to go beyond normative independence for those institutions. We have to go beyond normative support for those institutions and actually give them the support to do their work. Allow them to be the experts, the advisors, but also to hold those who fall short accountable. So that is one area that commitment will be shown if the anti-graft institutions have the power, ability to be able to actually do that which they are provided by law to do, i.e. fight corruption, hold people accountable, ensure that there is justice, and of course, eliminate impunity from the system.
Yeah,
I'm sure when particularly impunity is eliminated, there is a lot more belief and trust in the system, because one thing that corruption does, it has a very corrosive effect. It attacks trust. And when there's a distrust with political leaders, the political leaders and the people, including the military, then of course, you know the effect. The people tend to take the power into their own hands when they do not trust the system, for example, the system of justice, to doing what it has to do for them.
All right, I don't know what obtains in your country, but I think in Nigeria, the people that fight, the anti-corruption chiefs, so to speak, are oftentimes appointed by the sitting president. Don't you think that is something that should be looked at in part? If we're going to be fighting corruption, there should be some independence for this institution. What's your take about the leadership of anti-corruption agencies across Africa being appointed by their president?
I think it is more complex. I know that, yes, across the continent, the best practice is that the president appoints the anti-graft chiefs, including myself sitting here. But I think the problem really is not the appointment. It's about the courage of those who are appointed to do what is right. And also for them to have the required support mechanism. Some institutions don't have the resources to even fight corruption. Their budgets, they are starved of budgetary support, beyond the fact that they are not even given a free hand to do what they have to do. So there's a wider conversation around the operation and functioning of these institutions that go beyond merely the appointment of a person. Somebody can appoint somebody, but then that person has the ability to do what is right, what is just, what the law prescribes, and be able to do this fairly. So while I agree that the appointment could be a problem, particularly psychologically, but also practically, but the most important framework is the functionability of these institutions and those who are appointed to head them.
Okay, well, I mean, it is debatable because some people will say if I give you power, I can find a way to manipulate your actions in certain way, no matter how much, how honorable or courageous you are. If you're not playing to my tune, there's every tendency that I might put stones in your path to stop you from achieving your purpose. And at the end of the day, that makes handicap of the work that anti-corruption agencies are taking on. Don't you think it is an important thing that should be reviewed? Because if, no matter how courageous you are, the people that appointed you could put hurdles in place.
But that is a fair point, and I am not disagreeing with you. But what stops it from being the case if even you are appointed by somebody else or through some other path? We all know that executive presidents in Africa are very powerful. They are so powerful that they are only close to being a king. So what stops those hurdles to be from being there if, for example, you are appointed by the legislature, if you are appointed by the civil society, or through a complex process, you will still occupy an office that has a president who has enormous powers, and that president has the ability to control the resources that are allocated to you. That president has the ability to engineer processes around you, including going into the parliamentary system to impeach and remove you. That president has the ability to use the state security apparatus against you, including the police. They can plant evidence on you and raise a lot of negative propaganda around you. So while I agree with you that these things are significant, the appointment process, we say in common English, he who pays the piper dictates the tune. Yeah. But then, is the solution really changing the piper? We just create a new piper. It is about institutions working. It's about institutions being independent. It's about institutions being incapacitated to do what to do. I have never ever thought that the problem lies merely because the president appoints somebody. I believe it goes beyond that. I believe it is institutional decay and the lack of proper functionability of these institutions that is really causing the problem.
I guess that goes back to the commitment you talked about from leaders to equip the anti-corruption agencies with the right tools that they need. Another factor I would like you to speak on is the trust of the people. Some of these anti-corruption agencies that, are supposed to be fighting corruption are seen by some citizens as being used to hound those who are not members of the ruling parties in some cases. And there seemed to be a debt of trust between these anti-corruption agencies and the people. Isn't that wouldn't addressing that as well be one way to begin to revamp the corruption fight and in the long run might help with the war against coup?
Yes, certainly trust is important, and trust also in the institution that fights corruption is definitely important. But that is a source of power which an anti-graft institution has to understand, particularly an anti-graft leader. You need the people to be with you. You need to recruit their support. They need to be with you. If they do not stand with you and they are not supporting you, the day you are removed, nobody cares about your removal. Even the president will not be afraid to interfere with you. If a president thinks that if he removes you, he can be punished because there will be elections and people will vote against him for removing a powerful anti-graft fighter, then that is an advantage to you. So one of the ways of doing that, and which, for example, in Sierra Leone, we are doing very well, is public education. But also, it is about what you do. The public raise, there are whistleblowers, there are these days on social media issues come up, and of course, there are high-level corruption issues that come up. It's about what you do, your actions. How does the public filter and process them? Do they see you as being fair in your work? Do they see you as being responsive to their requests, to claims? Do they see you as holding people in the system in which you are operating the same way as you are holding other people who are outside of it? These are all factors that determine your credibility, your acceptability. And of course, it is very significant for every anti-graft fighter to be wary of this and to keep it in mind as they do their work. Because if you do not have the support of the people, then of course, you are taking as an elitist endeavor. You are just part of the regime, and being part of the regime means you are not different from the minister who is a politician or the president's boy.
How optimistic are you? I just wanted to stay on this before we move to the concluding part. How optimistic are you that African leaders will make the needed efforts to begin to retrace their steps and improve on governance and transparency?
I think these coups are a reminder to these other countries where coups have not taken place that people are unhappy because the level of discontent on the continent is high. That is mainly because of the economic discontent. Because I believe when we have a proper trickle-down economics, where people do not see inflation going up, where basic commodities, the prices of them are not changing around them every morning, when people work and they are paid fair wages for their work, they can have a decent life of dignity in their line of work. They do not live in a society where inequality remains to be galloping, and whilst the 1% continues to be richer, and then, of course, the majority, 99%, continues to live in poverty, then, of course, you will know that you are making effect as a politician, but also you are not at risk because nobody really will care about you. I believe that most of our politics is only around election time, where people go about their normal business without really caring, and they are not interested in what is happening within the political machinery when their lives are better. So I believe there is a reminder to all politicians, the leadership, the political class, that the Africa we are in is not ready to compromise, that they have to produce, and it's not the time for excuses and explanations. It's about making the lives of your people better. And I am optimistic that they are listening and they are aware.
All right, let's go regional and international now. These regional bodies and international players, when it comes to coup in Africa, we mentioned how important their role is. Is there ways you would suggest that these regional bodies and international partners can act to preempt and destabilize any coup attempt? Because the playbook seems to be evolving when it comes to coup d'etats in Africa.
Well, coup d'etats are surreptitious, usually. It takes high intelligence around a leader to be able to know them, even within the country. And I would be unfair to think that people outside of the country would have any more advantage than them. So, and if you read The Art of War, it will tell you that speed and secrecy are the backbone of surprise. And any coup that does not come as a surprise is likely to fail. So I don't think these coup leaders have read The Art of War. They understand exactly what to do. I don't think it is easier to preempt, but it is also possible to see that there are factors at play that could lead to military intervention. And that is where their action comes in. How do they take immediate steps or more appropriate steps to ensure that the issues, the discontent, the problems that are brewing, for example, when Alpha Conde wanted to change the constitution in Guinea, he didn't do it in a day. Everybody knew that that issue was going on for a long time. Ministers were resigning around him. Controversies were going on. Constitutional issues were happening. The opposition were demonstrating. I visited Conakry several times. There was a time I went there at night. I met the place like a war zone. My bodyguards and everybody were so scared by the time we got home. So it's not something that just happened in a day. But the question is, what did they do? The international community, what did they do to ensure that it does not escalate to a coup d'etat or for military intervention or even civil wars? These are the questions that we should be asking ourselves, even though we are saying that we are not in support of military coup. And I certainly am not in support of military interventions in African politics.
Okay, before we circle back to the citizens, what sort of actions would you expect to see from international communities to the scenario you painted? I mean, he didn't change the constitution overnight. It took time, and there were players who saw the trend and could predict what it could evolve to be. What kind of actions do you think could have been taken to help stop what we now saw?
Man, diplomatic is one of them. Go to this guy and tell him, don't. These sanctions that they are now introducing against military regimes could have been introduced against Guinea a long time ago. You have to find a way of putting pressure. There could be personal sanctions against leaders who do these things, like the US does. You saw Joe Biden is threatening Putin that if he invades Ukraine, there could be personal sanctions against him. These are things that we have to introduce in Africa within the international committee to protect the space against fighting the fire brigade kind of approach to rule of law and governance. You don't wait when the fire is burning the place down. That is the time you are taking a phone to call an ambulance to come in. By the time it arrives, the place could have been burned down already. But make sure you deploy your fire extinguishers early. Make sure you do your fire drills regularly. Make sure you have inspectors and monitors to review the fire mechanism systems and test them, and then take action. I think that is allegoric of what we are supposed to do in Africa to make sure that our region, particularly West Africa, is more stable.
All right, let me this last one from citizen participation. We talked about young people celebrating Coup, especially seeing where they are coming from, unemployment, hunger, poverty, and corruption that we've been stressing on. I want to ask, what steps must be taken to sort of rewire citizens' thinking on the dangers posed by coup across the continent? Because when it affects one, it affects the other.
There has to be an encouragement of citizen participation, particularly within the civil society space, because they play an important watchdog role. They raise the alarm. They mobilize people. So that they can also be a kind of, like I said, the fire extinguishers that are within the system. So if there is a proper system to ensure that they have a fair space to say what they have to say, to meet, to discuss, to raise their voices, to peacefully demonstrate, and of course to be able to call to order where they see things are going out of line, to do a lot of good for West Africa. So citizen participation and civil society empowerment is very key to changing the narrative.
Quickly, the role of the media here. Now, at times, most of these coups don't happen, and then the people know about it. They usually take over media organizations and make the announcement. Radio houses, television, people. What role does the media have here to help in pushing back the pressing for coup d'etat as an option out of our troubles?
I think the media is a very important aspect of any state. That is why they are called the fourth estate. There are usually three estates, and the fourth is the media. You have the presidency, the executive, you have the legislature, you have the judiciary, and the fourth is the media, which means they are an important part of the governance architecture. So raising their voice, raising the alarm, giving a voice to citizens, also making sure they give blackout to certain things, but also to voice out other things is very significant to what is happening, because a country where you have a vibrant media is usually more democratic than others that don't. So the media is really, really important, and encouraging them in terms of policy framework that supports them is very important in these African states.
All right, your final thoughts on the subject of corruption and the coup in West Africa?
Well, we have to ensure that we have a region-wide anti-corruption strategy, and which is one thing I will be taking to the meeting in Abuja in the next 4 weeks. We need to have a region-wide anti-corruption strategy where we support other countries that are struggling in their anti-corruption campaigns, but also voice support for them, share experiences, have borderless investigations, and of course, be able to trace assets, particularly illicit financial flows, across the region. So that will help us in being stronger in fighting corruption. And since corruption is the key, number one justification for coup d'etats. If we fight corruption strongly, we would have removed one of the greatest justifications for it, and then it will bring us into an era of prosperity for our people.
I want to thank you very much, Mr. Francis Kaifala, for speaking with us on this very important subject. Thank you very much,
Felicity. I wish you all well at New Central. Thank you for having me again.
Thank you for honoring us. All right. The famous writer Chinua Achebe once wrote that a functioning, robust democracy requires a healthy, educated, participatory followership and an educated, morally grounded leadership. There's no doubt he was a very wise man. These coups, as our guests have said, must serve as a wake-up call for democratically elected leaders to deliver good governance to the people. They make it even more imperative to reawaken the belief that democracy can deliver for the people of Africa. Thank you very much for watching. As always, I will see you next week. Bye for now.